The wind off the wall had a way of finding every seam a man possessed. It slipped under John's collar and prickled the back of his neck as if the cold had grown cunning fingers. The black stones of the parapet kept the day's meager warmth a while, but it bled away at dusk and the night made a meal of it. He moved along the top walk as men had done since there were words for such things, boots crunching frost into a sugar of white, breath pluming in a slow, steady measure that Ghost matched in silence beside him. The direwolf's coat looked more like snow than snow did, and in the half-light his red eyes glowed as if banked coals watched the haunted forest and judged it wanting. Below, the world stretched black and blue into the far distance. The forest was a sleeping ocean with waves of spruce and pine and fir. In the hollows, mist pooled, and where the ground broke the skin of that sea, ancient stones jutted like the ribs of a dead thing. Far off, a single pale line limned the edge of a frozen stream. John listened. The wall had its own music, creaks and sighs and tiny crackling whispers, the grouse of chafing ice, the deep slow heart of it beating somewhere in the deeps where the light never went. There were other sounds too. The clink of links as the winchmen worked the great wheel on the lift, the distant jingle of a harness, and Dolorous Ed's familiar cough, like a man trying to clear a joke from his throat. "You'll freeze whatever parts aren't frozen already," Ed said when John reached him. Ed had a huddled way of standing, as if the wind might mistake him for a stack of old clothes and blow him away. "And the wind will carry them off one by one, and you'll wake with nothing left but your eyes. Then we'll all be comforted, because the Lord Commander can glare the others to death." John inclined his head as if considering this. "I'll have Ghost bite the wind first." "Good," Ed said. "I've always thought the wind too proud. If a dire wolf won't humble it, nothing will." From here, the torches down in the yard looked like a scattering of fallen stars. The builder's tower cast a long barrel shadow across the beaten snow, and something else, no more than a crate, had been hauled close to its base. Men clustered there, and the light shivered as if men's breath could wobble fire. The yard rang with a certain careful energy, the sound of men doing everything slower than they might, because they knew haste here had teeth. John's gaze returned to the crate. It followed it. "They brought it out from the stores," he said, scratching his chin through scarf and glove and a decade of old jokes. "I told them I'm a dour man and not fond of surprises. They told me it's not a surprise if you know it's coming. Then I told them cold and death aren't surprises either, and we're none the happier when they turn up." "Who told them to bring it?" John asked, though he suspected he'd find his own words in Ed's answer. "You did, Lord, when you told me in words that sounded suspiciously like orders," Ed said. "And I obeyed them because obedience is cheaper than courage. What's inside it is not cheaper than anything. It's the sort of thing that has a price the world pays." John nodded once. The letter had come 2 days past, carried in by a wildling boy with a hairlip and eyes like skinned plums. The boy had a way of standing that said he would not go farther south than he had, and that every step south had been an argument he'd lost. He had not known how to read the marks on the birchbark scroll. Tormund had carved them himself, the characters long and crude as antler scrawls, and the message had smelled of smoke and seal fat and the last thin line between a joke and a warning. "I found what Mance sought and never held," Tormund had written. "I found the thing he loved to lie about. Do not use it and do not let it be used. But if you must, use it as a man uses a knife, from the right side of the skin and not at your own throat." With the thieves' light of the wildlings in his words, Tormund had drawn a mark to show a place. A break of ground under a tooth of black basalt near the milkwater, where ice had done the work of pry bars and time had done the work of thieves. He had sent the thing itself by a separate path, in a sealed crate roped to a sledge, pulled by 2 shaggy ponies whose breath smoked like chimneys. The men who led the ponies had the look of bones covered by wind, and when they'd come through the gate, they'd stood there in a solemn line while the crows had peered down from their rafters and Ghost had sniffed them one by one. "What do you call a thing you'd sooner keep for an enemy than see in a friend's hands?" Ed had asked then. "Curse," John said. "Ah," said Ed, "that's shorter." Now the crate waited outside the builder's tower. It had been opened once by the builders, just enough to let the cold out of it. The men had gone quiet then, with the careful stiffness of men who feel their teeth and realize they are not their own. John descended from the top walk, Ghost padding so close their shoulders brushed. The air in the yard had a different timbre than on the wall. More men in it, more smoke and salt and horse and cumin. A few young brothers were working in pairs with blunted swords, and a stable boy was carrying a basket of turnips as if it contained a newborn lamb. When the brothers saw John, they stopped their motions with that mixture of relief and burden that always greeted command. It put a layer invisible as thin ice between him and them. The crate was marked with a burnt sigil, no sigil at all, but a circle with 9 short strokes carved inward like teeth. That mark repeated itself around the wax seal that still clung to the board where the lid met the body. The wax was black as spent torches. Caught the light without enjoying it. John set his glove to it and felt, even through leather, a faint, strange chill that did not feel like cold air on skin but like the absence of something inside the hand where warmth ought to be. Samuel Tarley had spent the hours between the crate's arrival and now with a lamplight and a book, which made them ordinary hours by his measure. He emerged from the tower with his arms full. "I found a mention of the sign," Sam said without preamble, breathless with the relief of having a thing to say when everyone else had only breath. "In a treatise that's older than the paper thinks it is. The author talks about a ring of speech, a circle like a mouth, and the strokes are the tongues of the north. He says it is used to seal things that speak." Ed made a face. "If it's a mouth, I'd rather put a boot in it than a seal." "The author says it comes from the old days," Sam went on, "from before names were made into prisons. He says the children of the forest had horns that could carry words farther than sight, and that some words were not words at all but the memory of a thing, what it was to be it."
Sam swallowed.
"There's a list of the horns, too. Most of it is in a tongue I can't read, and the rest is in a boy's handwriting who tried to write it centuries later and couldn't rightly remember. But one name is written again and again as if the author liked the sound of it. Joramun's horn. Old Joramun woke the giants from the earth," Ed said, touching Ghost's shoulder as if to be certain of the earth in that reality. "I've never seen a giant asleep in the earth, but I've seen rocks walk under snow, and I don't care for the tricks of sleeping. Joramun also broke the power of a king," Sam said softly, not looking at John as he said it. "The note says the horn is not a thing of ice or fire but of binding, the tightness that holds. It says the horn can summon things bound to it, or loose things bound wrongly." John studied the seal. In the black wax, a faint whirl like the pattern of a fingerprint spiraled from the circle outward. It made him think of eddies under river ice, the little wheels that turned even when all seemed still. He rested his hand upon the lid again. Through the leather he could feel more than cold. He felt a subtle hum, a vibration as steady as sleep, very like the wall's deep pulse but quicker, as if a smaller heart were beating inside. He had dreamed in the night after the crate had come. He had not told the dream to Sam, nor to Ed, nor to anyone. In the dream he had been Ghost and he had not been Ghost. He had run through trees whose bark had soaked up 1,000 winters, and from each bole a face watched him. 1,000 faces and one face, eyes bleeding tears of sap, mouths wrinkled and white. Snow fell very gentle. In the dream he had heard a call, a note so low that it was not a note until it found him, and then it became a command as plain as a hand on the back. "Come home." He had risen to it with the joy a hound feels when the door opens and the hunter whistles. Then something in him remembered there were 2 doors, and the whistle might lead to either, and all at once the joy had teeth. He had woken with his mouth full of iron taste. His fingers clenched in the blanket as if something had tried to pull him up and through the raw air. "Open it," John said. The builders had done their work with care. They had left stout pegs of wood in the sides. A man could lever the lid up without jarring whatever lay within. The wax crackled and flaked under the chisel's edge, snapping like a frozen leaf. As the seal parted, a smell rose, older than the crate, older than men at this wall, old wood, old moss, the faint copper of old blood washed away 100 times and still present. Ed said something under his breath. Sam's eyes went round as winter moons. Inside, The horn lay upon a bed of dark fur. It was longer than John's arm, black as a night with no snow to soften it, and bound in bands of something not quite metal and not quite stone. The bands had been set with dragonglass nodules that caught the light in a way no honest thing should, each flake reflecting the torch flames with a flare that seemed to bloom inward, as if the glass remembered fire and could not help but show it. Along the horn's curve, fine lines had been incised. He recognized some of the markings as the children's script. Others were as strange as frost flowers. At the mouth, the lip had been sealed with a plug of resinous amber. Within the amber, a single feather lay, white as ghost, white as heart-tree bark. "Don't care for that," Ed said into the quiet. "I don't like my horns to come with their own last breath trapped inside." Sam set his books down as carefully as if they were eggs. He reached but stopped short of touching. "There are notches here," he murmured, squinting. 8, 9, 10, no. It looks like 9. No number of 9 I like in the north. "Everything is 9 until it's 10, Ed offered, with the gloomy cheer of a man trying not to hear something else entirely. John reached then. When his fingers touched the horn, a shiver traveled up his arm, as if he had dipped his hand into deep water. He saw, in a flash that was not sight, a standing ring of trees under Aurora. He smelled smokes that were not made of wood. He heard, felt, a layout of notes like stepping stones across a river of silence. For an instant he thought he could play them, that he had known them once before he had a name. Ghost pressed against him. The direwolf's ruff bristled. A low sound grew in his chest, and it was a warning and a welcome both. John lifted the horn out. It was lighter than it looked and heavier, both. The weight did not lie where he expected. It kept itself, the way a man with a sword knows where his blade is even in the dark. The bands of not metal bit cool into his palm. He held it to the torch. In the flame's flicker, the lines of the old script seemed to twitch like leaves shaken by a hand that was not wind. "No good will come of blowing it," Sam whispered, and then, because he was Sam, he added, "Unless good does come, and even then it won't look like what we expect." "Once," John said, "my Lord Father told me a story of a man who brought a knife to his own throat and said, 'I will never use it.' When the day came that he needed a knife, he had none, and so he died without ever breaking his vow." He rested the horn along his forearm, feeling how it rested there like a living thing that had found the curve to match its own. "We won't blow it now. Now is my favorite time not to blow things," Ed said. They took the horn into the tower. In the small room where the builders sometimes took their oatcakes out of the wind, John laid it across the table. The table looked small then, and the horn looked not large but right. Sam lit 2 more lamps, then 3, then 1 again when he realized he had lit too many and the room's shadows had all fled to crouch in the corners and stare. On the far side of the table lay the birch bark copy Tormund had sent, a rubbing of the script from the band nearest the mouth. Sam had compared it with drawings from an old account of the first men's bargains. "These here," Sam said, tapping with his forefinger, "they are not names. They are oaths. The shapes are to be spoken like paths are walked. Left to right, then right to left, then not at all, and then again but softer. The sense of them is this: what was taken cold must be given cold. What was given to the ground must not be taken to the air. What breath shapes, breath may break." "Breath may break," Ed repeated. "If breath breaks, what do we do with the pieces? Sweep them. There are notes added later," Sam said, the way a man admits to the presence of bones under his house. "A warning. If you unbind what is bound and there is no binding ready, all bonds break. And here, the cold ones cannot speak our music, but they can listen and pretend to heed, and sometimes that is worse than their silence." John rested a hand on the horn and felt the hum that wasn't sound, the way a man feels the pulse under a wrist. Outside, a gust ran its hand over the wall so that the whole world sighed. In that sigh, John heard something he had not known he was listening for. He stood, went to the slit window and looked out. The night over the forest was not black. It was a deep thing steeped in blue. Clouds had drawn thin veils so high that stars swam like fish in a dim river. Between one breath and another, something moved in the treeline. He did not see it. He perceived the way stillness changes when a new thing enters it. A line of crows rose suddenly from a stand of fir, black flecks thrown up by a throwing hand. Ghost came to the window at his side, set his forepaws on the ledge, and made no sound at all. "They are nearer," John said. Ed's humor left his face like heat from a cup. "How near?" "Near enough that the trees are telling the sky about them," John said, and it did not sound mad in his own mouth. There were horn calls made on the wall, honest horns of bull and wood and iron. John had heard them since boyhood. Single long call for a returning party, 2 blasts for wildlings, 3 for others. He had never heard 3. He did not want to. He waited because a man can stand in a doorway and hold a house by standing. The wind shifted and brought him smells. Pine pitch, old urine in the snow, the iron tickle of the horn on the table like a taste in his nose, and under that, so very faint, a scent that did not belong to any world men walked. Something like deep water and old meat and the cold under stones that never see day. The hair along his arms prickled even under wool and fur. The yard below had quieted a little when word spread. No man says the word others if he can say aught else. They sharpened spearheads by rote and argued about bread to avoid arguing about what mattered. Tormund would have called it a time for a good song and a loud one, to make the quiet feel like a choice. Tormund was not here. "Will you send for the men at Greyguard and the Shadow Tower?" Sam asked. "I sent a raven when the crate came," John said. "Another when we opened it. If the sky eats letters today, it will have a full meal." The horn lay on the table like a question the room would not ask because the answer might be listening. John thought of Tormund's mark, the 9 tongues pointing inward, a seal for mouths. He thought of his dream and the word that had not been a word. Come home. What was the home of a breath? What did it mean to call breath to its house? The first horn blast came then from the top walk, a single long note. John didn't realize how nearly he'd come to expecting 3 until he heard one. He felt shame for the relief that washed him. 2 blasts followed, crisp in the frost-bitten air. Wildlings. That was an old fear, and he had learned its shape. Men poured to their posts, glad for the excuse of a known enemy. Ed took a spear without comment, as if it were a jest. John went back up with Ghost at his heel and the old horn cradled against his side. On the wall, the night was bigger. Torches burning in copper cups cast little islands of honey light. Beyond them was the sea of blue-black. The watchmen had their bows up. The bowstrings hummed in the cold, taut as lies. John peered down. In his mind, he sought the movement he had felt before, that wrinkle in the cloth of the dark. He found it where the bushy crown of a pine trembled and a herd of little shapes flurried out and froze. Rabbits. They stood white upon white, small blots of life. They did not flee again. They did not move at all. He saw them only because he was looking right at them. If a man's eye had slid a foot to the left, he would have called the night empty. Between one blink and the next, another line of shapes appeared at the treeline. They were not men, except in the way they were not men. They were thin where they should have had thickness, and their motion was wrong. The wrongness did not lie in swiftness or slowness, but in the cadence of their walking, as if they were being pulled forward and their feet moved later to justify it. He had seen whites enough to know them even when the snow held them half swallowed. He watched a birch bough under the weight of a passing hand, though the hand left no print. Farther back, a pale blue flicker moved between trunks. He could not call it light. It was the idea of winter given eyes. 2, Ed muttered. I told the horn man to blow 2 and not 3 because 3 knocks all the warmth out of a man before the others ever get the chance. Loose, John said softly, and arrows fell in a dark rain that made no sound he could hear from this height. They buried themselves in snow and straw hair and bone and wood. Some of the whites dropped like wheat at a second cutting. Others turned their heads toward the base of the wall with the slow, curious tilt of birds. In the flickers of torchlight, their eyes glittered with no humor at all. There were old magics woven into the wall. John had felt them from his childhood in the way a child feels that an old tree is older than his father, older than his father's bones. He had seen White stop at the ice as if the air had become glass. He had watched a hand scrabble and smoke and withdraw. But there were so many shapes now. He could not count them and did not try. He looked to the horn in his arm. The old seal's resin plug had a flaw, no bigger than a pinhead, through which a thread of cold air might pass. He put his thumb over it without thinking, and something in his chest eased as if a draft in a house had been stopped. Sam materialized at his side, breath white as a standard. "There's another note," he said, words tumbling. In the marginalia in the student's hand. He wrote, "Blown before the weirwood, the horn speaks one language. Blown upon the ice far from leaves, it speaks another. When the winter is in the breath, don't let it be in the message. Speak plainly," Ed said, not unkindly, as if he had a cup he would hold out if only he knew what drink to expect. "Trees," Sam said helplessly. "The old ones. The children carved their writing in living wood. The horns, its song, listens to that. If there are none to listen, it will listen to whatever answers." John thought of the feather trapped in amber. He thought of the old breath caught and kept for a day like this. The feather had once lived. It had known branches and air. He looked out at the forest and pictured the faces hidden there, the silent patience. For a heartbeat he felt an absurd urge to carry the horn down off the wall and into the trees, to lay it at the foot of the oldest heart tree and beg it to tell him how to blow. Below, the whites came on. Men at the base of the wall formed their lines, torches thrust out like teeth. The first ranks of dead met the fire and faltered. A dozen set alight and burned with a candle's ruthlessness. Behind them, the pale flicker in the trees paused. The night took a breath. John raised the horn. He felt, as his lips neared the resin, the strangest fear. Not of what would come, but that no sound would. He had blown hunting horns as a boy at Winterfell, had filled them with his breath and been glad when they replied. This horn might not answer him. It might ask him to answer it. He pressed the horn to his mouth and felt the cold of resin and old amber. The feather seemed to tickle the space on the other side. He did not blow as a boy might, hard and deep. He gave a gentle breath, a tester, a small, questioning exhale. The horn drank it. That was the only word John's mind could form. It drank. His breath went into it and did not come out again. The hum under his hand deepened, like a cat's purr becoming a growl. He felt the old lines in the horn's body like the grain of a tree under bark. He let more breath go. His chest lightened, and with the lightness came a weight, a new heaviness that began somewhere under his breastbone and drew his blood in with it, slow and sure. The sound rose then, not loud, not like the bullhorns that turned whole hillsides into ears, but low and true. It was not a note in the way that a brass horn makes a note. It was the sound of a door opening in a house he had never lived in but had walked past his whole life. It made the hairs on his neck stir again, not from cold but from recognition. Ed's eyes went wide and soft. Sam's mouth dropped open and he made a little O without realizing. Ghost pressed his head against John's hip and then lifted his muzzle to the sky, but he did not howl. He listened. The note spread out over the wall and down its face as if the horn poured warmth. Only the warmth was not heat. It was shape. It filled the places between ice crystals where there is only structure and made those places believe they were held. It went into the air and made the air remember what air was for, to carry breath, to carry words, to carry not only cold. It sank into the snow and made the snow remember that it had been water, and before that, cloud, and before that, something a tree had drunk. The horn sang that the world was itself. Men at the base of the wall lifted their faces. The dead did not. Yet, in that first answering moment, a dozen whites stumbled as if struck. Not by a blow, but by the removal of a rope that had been pulling them. One fell, awkward, like a puppet put down. Another's head jerked up, not toward the wall but toward the forest. As if called by a mother's voice it did not know it knew. The pale flicker in the trees slid sideways, like a fish that has realized the current is not what it thought. John stopped. He had not run out of breath. The horn could have drunk him for a long time yet. He stopped because he felt as a man feels when he is walking a narrow bridge and realizes that the rail under his hand is not for balance but to keep him from learning what lies beneath. The hum in the horn did not stop at once. It faded like a brand tucked into ash. He put the mouth from his lips and closed his mouth around air like a drowning man that has remembered air is for more than being between water and throat. Ed blew out a slow breath that might have been a prayer or a curse. "Well," he said, "that's the ugliest pretty thing I've ever heard." Sam clutched at his book with both hands. "Did you feel it?" "Oh, of course you did. You stood in the door of it as if you'd built the house." He swallowed. "When you breathed it, it was like words written upon a skin, and then the skin was the air, and then the air was... Oh, I don't know, I'm sorry, It tugged at them," John said, eyes still on the treeline. "Not the bodies, the strings." The dead below were regrouping, untroubled by the absence of pain. Yet now, when they came on, their cadence had changed, a ripple out of time with itself. The pale flicker in the trees moved closer to the edge and then stilled. No breath misted there. The cold around it did not behave like other cold. It stung the eyes to look at it. It was not a thing. It was the idea that things end. The horn had warmed in John's hands. He curled his fingers more firmly about it, and when he did, the bands of knot metal seemed to sink fractionally into his skin, as if reminding his hands of where they belonged. He felt an urge then, sharp and sudden, dangerous as hunger, to blow again, but deeper, stronger, to empty himself into the horn and see what emptiness could do when made into a blade. He set his jaw against it. Hunger is a kind of wind. It makes men mistake their yearning for direction. "Don't," Sam said at once, and then, seeing John's face, added, "Not yet. It listened to you. That matters. But if it's a language, we ought to know our own words before we say too many." A second horn call came from the top walk, human and brisk, the two-blast note riding hard. The men at the base of the wall pulled back into the lights. The dead, for the moment, did not press forward. The pale flicker withdrew a pace, like a hand that had reached into a fire and found it real. The rabbits in the open finally moved, every one of them at once, a white stirring that flowed as if one mind had made the choice. They vanished into the deeper white and were gone. That night, the dead did not come on. They watched from the shadow of pines and from behind the ragged shoulders of drifts as high as men. The men on the wall listened a long time to silence that had become a thing you could hear. In the rooms under the builder's tower, the horn lay upon the table catching lamplight in its black. John could not keep his eyes from it. If he closed them, he saw the feather in amber and the little flaw in the seal and the way the bands made 9 mouths, all shut. He slept an hour and woke with the taste of resin on his tongue. He slept another and woke beneath an old, familiar weight, like Snow the Bastard again, with the world sitting on his chest reminding him that names are shifts of cloth and some clothes itch no matter how long you wear them. At dawn the light came slowly as if it had been asked permission. It found the horn and made nothing of it. It found Ghost and made him radiant. John went to the open door and stood breathing the air that is not warm even when it is morning. He remembered the word that was not a word. Home. He spoke aloud in the empty room. "Who's home?" The silence held its breath respectfully in case it should have to reply. Sam came with 2 cups of something that had once aspired to be soup before life made it into broth. "I kept reading," he said miserably, as if confessing to sin. "It was likely foolish. The margins are a young man's argument with his master across 300 years of cold. But there's a piece I cannot stop thinking on. The student speaks of a horn used not to bring down stone but to bring down names. He says that when spoken over the dead in the old tongue of the leaves, he uses a word that means unthreaded, as in the thread that ties the body to the cold song that moves it." Sam looked away for a flicker. If you can unthread a thing, though, you can also knot it elsewhere if you're not careful. John thought of ropes. He had hauled his share with the lift teams and in the yards where ships took a mooring they didn't trust. He pictured a knot tied wrong, the way it could look clever and still come loose at the first tug. He pictured tying a dead man to the wrong music. The horn wanted breath. It was made for it. He was made of breath. He had his men to think of, and the men who trusted them in houses of smoke and laughter from here to the gift and beyond. He took the horn up again before noon, but he did not blow it. He carried it up to the top walk and stood with it under his cloak and let the wind find it. The wind made a little keening along the edge of the resin plug. The sound felt like a beast too small to be dangerous and too hungry to be left alone. The men pretended not to hear. They ordered their lives by pretending to look at one thing while they counted the other. In the afternoon, a wildling came. She came alone. A tall woman with hair braided with bone and a face seemed like an old shoe that had walked joyfully through rocks. She did not ask to be let in. She stood at the line under the wall where men came to parley and spoke in a voice like split wood. "I have seen the pale riders," she said to the men above who could not quite look at her. "They are counting. Something in the forest makes them count. I have 7 children in the snow. If the wall will not have us, the snow will. If the snow has us, the riders will. I am not fond of arithmetic." John went down to the yard and from the yard to the gate. Ghost went with him. The wind had sharpened some new tooth in the hours since dawn, and the sky beyond the clouds had a brittle look, the look of glass put in a fire on a dare. He met the woman at the parley line and saw that her eyes were greener than a pine's needles when the day pretends to be spring. She looked at the horn under his cloak and then at Ghost and then at John as if she deigned to see the last only because the others had told her to. "Giant's Bane says you have a toy that is not a toy," she said. "He says it will do what a thing does if you ask it right, and what a thing wants if you don't. Giant's Bane's toys are mostly knives and stories," John said. "Both cut 2 ways. Stories cut deeper," she said without smile. "Knives only go as far as the ribs. Stories go through the bone to what is behind it." She held out her hand, palm up. It was a broad hand, calloused, with 2 fingers crooked where they had healed around some old mishap. "Iaem menella. I've borne 6 and I buried another. I would keep the next thing I hold." He did not give her the horn. He gave her food, which is the other thing a man owes when he cannot give what is asked. She ate standing still, as if the food were another parley and she had no clever words for it. When she had eaten, she looked north with a face that had picked up whatever light the day had to spare. "You'll blow it, Crow?" she said softly, without accusation. "Because there are more of them than there are of you, and men always blow what they must when they cannot carry it." She touched 2 fingers to her brow. It looked almost like a prayer and almost like an insult, which meant it could serve for both. She went back north into the pines. Night came then, as if it had been listening and had decided not to keep them waiting. The dead tested the fire again. They came close and stopped at the edge of where the torches made the world comprehensible and found that it did not suit them. The pale riders did not show themselves. The flicker moved differently, not closer, not farther, but sideways, as if sniffing the length of the wall for a seam in a thing that had no seam. Just before midnight, snow began. It fell very fine at first, a flower sifted slow by a careful hand. It thickened by degrees until the torches grew halos and the world felt smaller, as if the sky had taken pity and drawn near. The snow had a hush inside it, a kind of private silence, so that even the wall's murmurs seemed to speak softer. In that hush John heard it again, the knot note waiting in the horn. Ghost lifted his muzzle and sniffed. His ears pricked. His tail, usually carried low and indifferent, rose and quivered with the delicate attention of a well-bred hound at point. John lifted the horn and found that his hands had warmed it. He could feel the grain beneath the bands, the faint ridges where some old knife had carved the script. He set the mouth to his lips once more. This time he did not feed it a testing trickle. He gave it a steady line of breath, not all he could, not yet, but enough to know himself in the giving. The resin softened under his mouth like a kiss given to wax. The sound rolled out, deeper than before, bigger, still not loud, still not a shout, but a river found in a dry place. It ran along the wall and sank into the snow. It found the air and told it the old story about what it was for. Told the dead something too. They jerked like fish when a net is pulled. Not all of them. Patches of the line faltered. and in those patches whatever moved them stuttered. Bodies fell in angles that had no regard for knees or shoulders. Some got to their feet again. Some did not. The pale flicker became a blade, and then a spear, and then a hand, and then the hand withdrew. John felt, through the horn, a resistance, like pushing against ice with a pole and finding the ice very deep and very patient. Beneath that patience lay something else, something like the craving he had felt in himself when he raised the horn. It wanted him, not his breath exactly, but what breath carried, his promise, his shape, his self-made music. It wanted to put him in its counting. He pulled his mouth away, and the horn's song died more slowly than it had begun, unthreading from the air like a loom's work loosened. Sam had tears on his face. He didn't seem to know it. "It's like speaking to a man listening at a door he will not open," he breathed. "He can hear you, you can make him hear you, but he will not move unless you say the word that he thinks is his." "What word is that?" Ed asked bleakly. "The first word he ever learned," Sam said. "His name." John held the horn as if it were a weight that his bones had agreed to carry. Names. He had been Jon Snow all his life and something else besides, and names had never kept him from anything but gratitude. He thought of Bran's voice across a winter of stone, brother. He thought of Ned Stark's hand on his head, son. He thought of oaths made before a heart tree with red leaves, where men give their names to something old and ask it to keep them. He thought of the vows of the Watch, which had felt like braid work upon him when he spoke them, binding and comforting all at once. Binding. The horn script was a scroll of bindings. A thought came to him then, clear as a torch caught by a gust. It did not feel clever. Felt like something finally noticed. "The others bind the dead with their cold," he said. "They make a knot of winter through a man's bones, and the knot moves him. If the horn is for unthreading and for binding." He felt foolish as he spoke it, because nothing a man can say sounds as if it will change the way winter thinks. "Then perhaps we can tie their knot to ours, to the walls, to the oaths sworn under the trees. Perhaps we can tell the dead a different name than the one the cold gave them." "You plan to teach corpses their names?" Ed said in that flat voice that made mockery feel like mercy. "I'm not sure I remember all mine. I suppose we could give them the smaller ones first, toe, ear, and so on, before we move on to Donal Noye's favorite curse and Jon Snow's grim little smile." Sam looked terrified and alight. "John, if you blow it at the heart tree," he said, voice lowering as if the words themselves knew they should not be common. "If you set the message to the wood that remembers, the wall is old with oaths. They were pounded into it like iron into ice. The horn could take that oath and call breath to it. Or it could take the wall's oath apart," Ed said. "We might wake with nothing between us and a great deal of unpleasant company. The sort who knock first with their knuckles and then with their skulls." John weighed the horn. The resin was softer now where his mouth had pressed, as if his breath were rewinding time in the small. The feather in amber lay just so, white ribbing visible, delicate veins parted like fingers. It did not seem like a thing made to break, though amber is brittle. It seemed like a thing made to keep keeping. "We will not bring the wall down," John said. He said it as he had learned to say command, not as a suggestion to the world, but as a truth the world would learn. He set the horn down and set his palm upon it and felt the low thrum answer his skin. "But we can take it a piece of itself and carry it where we need it." "How do you carry a piece of a mountain?" Ed asked. "Some men would say you put it in your heart. I have never had much luck with that method. The stones get into my blood and make my elbows ache." John smiled, and the smile startled him because it felt like a younger man's smile, the kind he had had when he thought worlds could be fitted into pockets if only he folded them just right. "You carry it in a breath," he said. "In a horn." He looked north to where the forest held its breath as well. "At dawn we go to the grove." The dawn was a thin bowl of milk that had been left on a doorstep and forgotten. The snow had stopped near morning, and the world lay under it like a sleeping child, beautiful and unaware. They went down by the eastern stairs, where the steps were a stair's worth of lives laid atop each other. and out by the hunter's gate where a spruce had grown up right against the wall there long ago and left its sap on the stone as a reminder. The party was small. Ed, because he would not let a poor idea go into the cold without him. Sam, because he could not leave the thought of a marginal note unlooked for in the wood itself. 5 brothers of the watch, chosen for the steadiness of their breath if not their hands. Nella the wildling had come back in the dark with 2 of her 7. A boy who looked at the horn as if it were a story he had heard all his life, and a girl who looked at it as if it were a new animal she might feed. She came because she told John she would, which is the best reason a person can give. Ghost ranged ahead, a pale thought moving under branches that sagged with the night's gift. The forest took them in and changed them. Men became shapes. Shapes became the idea of men. The snow underfoot made that hush again, so that each step sounded like a hand upon a soft cloth. Here and there a tree had shed a small avalanche from a low bough. In those places the dark needles showed through like hair on a wound. Between trunks they crossed little tongues of ice where water had insisted on going somewhere until it had to stop and remember how to wait. The grove lay in a fold of the forest where the ground curved like a palm open to the sky. The heart tree at its center was old enough to have been present when men had no words for old. Its face was a scar and not a scar, carved and living both. Snow lay enfolded in its roots, and around it 9 smaller trees stood, their thin red leaves whispering though there was no wind for them. Blood had been spilled in this place. The earth remembered, and the trees remembered for the earth so it would not have to bear all that weight alone. John stood before the heart tree and felt again the braidwork of vows, invisible and present. He had ID those words here or in places like it, and years had draped themselves atop them like cloaks atop a hook, but the hook held the weight. He lifted the horn. For a heartbeat he closed his eyes. In his mind he saw Winterfell, its towers rising like fingers against a sky of iron. He saw a boy holding a wooden sword and wanting to be seen. He saw a man in a black cloak kneeling before leaves like tongues. He saw a girl with wolf's eyes and another with a queen's politeness thrown like sand at a storm. He saw a brother in a chair beneath the moon making ravens into letters and letters into futures. He saw a white wolf stepping into snow without sound and a shadow that had once been a man. He put the horn to his lips. He breathed as a man breathes when he means to answer a question he cannot bear to hear again. The horn swallowed his breath, and then the breath did not disappear. It went out of him and it went into him again by another road. It went into the tree. He felt it. He felt the old bark take it, the sap take it, the red leaves take it, and then he felt it spread into the roots, into the ground, into all the other trees nearby through the white threads that make a forest's mind, where mushrooms think slowly and intimately and never alone. The note rose and deepened. It became a plate of sound. He could feel the oaths in it like strands. He could feel what a vow is in the marrow. A choice cut again each day on a whetstone whose grit is your life. The others in the grove fell very still. Ed's spear point lowered until it touched the snow. He did not know he had done it. Sam sank to his knees in a drift and left his mouth open to catch flakes that were not falling. Nella shut her eyes and put a hand over her belly, as if to quiet a child who had not yet been made. When the sound had become large enough to be almost too much to bear, and yet not nearly enough, John shifted his breath. He did not blow harder. He changed the shape of his mouth upon the resin. He gave the note a bend, a turn, a small, deliberate error. It made the sound grieve and then forgive. It made the sound remember that binding is not breaking, though breaking can masquerade as binding. He thought of the dead at the wall. He thought of the cold not in their bones, tight, cunning, merciless in its economy. He thought of unthreading it, not like tearing a seam but like loosening a child's knot without scaring the child. He put that thought into the note. He did not know how he did it. He only did it. Far away, the dead paused. He knew it with the same knowledge by which a man knows when someone has spoken his name in a crowded hall. The horn told him so, but not in words. The pale flicker straightened upright and thrummed, and for a moment it was like looking into nothing so pure it burned. Pushed. The push came down the line of air and branch and frost. It came along the white threads of the forest's mind. It came down through the heart tree's old veins and into the horn and through the horn into John. He felt it as a hand against his chest. The hand was very cold and very clean. It did not feel like death, not exactly. It felt like an eraser. He did not stop. He could not. He wove the breath he had into the breath the trees gave back to him. He offered the wall's vow, the part of it that says we are the shield that guards the realms of men. The horn drank and sang and gave. The note went out again, not larger, but truer. Said, "This is home." Said, "Your breath is not for that cold." Said, "If you must be bound to us." Somewhere in the line of dead, a boy of 15 years who had once been a miller's son and had learned to laugh without moving his face because his teeth were bad, fell to his knees. The knot in him loosened, not all at once, not in glory, but in the small, exact way that the knot was made easy. The dead thing that had been him jerked as if someone had cut 2 of the 9 strings that pulled him, and then it was still, and then it toppled to the side like a sack. The cold in its eyes went out like a candle when a door opens and daylight steps in. Another fell. The third. Not many. Not enough to make Ed's jokes unnecessary. But some. The pale flicker did not retreat. It leaned. It made a sound without sound. In the horn, the hum sharpened to a desperate sweetness. John's lips hurt with cold and pressure. His chest burned. His eyes ran with water that turned to salt icicles on his cheeks. He kept blowing until he had given all the breath that a man can give and not die, and then stopped before the line moved. The sound went on for a heartbeat. Then it folded up and lay down like a faithful hound. He staggered. Ghost was there. The direwolf's body was a fact the world could not argue with. John leaned into that fact and found his feet again. Sam was crying outright and not hiding it now. He wiped at his face with the heel of his hand and got a palm of cold for his trouble. "You did it," he said, voice cracked. "You did something. Gods be good. You did something." Ed's mouth worked. He looked at the heart tree's face with its long, bleeding eyes and said dryly, "If you've just taught corpses to swear the oath, I want to be clear that I won't be bunking with any of them. I snore and they don't breathe. It would be awkward." Nella was standing very straight. She had not moved throughout. The snow that had gathered on her braids had melted and refrozen in a necklace of ghosts. "The pale ones felt that," she said. "They hate to feel. You gave them a thought, Crow. They like doing the thinking." John lowered the horn. He might have dropped it, but his hands would not permit it. He felt the bands in his palms as if they had been there a long time and he had only just noticed. He was very tired and very awake. The world had a strange clarity, as if someone had polished the air with ice. "Not enough," he said. Came out almost like a laugh and almost like loneliness. "But something is better than the nothing I'm used to," Ed observed. "If we keep going at this rate, in 100 winters we'll have made quite a dent." "Don't make a joke," Sam said, and then, realizing to whom he'd spoken, flinched from his own fear. "No, make a joke.
I'm sorry."
"Do whatever. Just, oh, Seven save us." He turned to John with that urgent look he had when a thought had caught him. "If we can unthread them from that cold, if we can bind them to the wall's oath for even a breath, maybe we can send them on. Not keep them, not make them crows, but let them go. Like loosening a rope and letting the boat drift to where it wanted to go before you tied it." "Don't start letting boats drift near my wall," Ed said. "You'll have us all up to our necks in passengers." John nodded, not because there was a plan in his head, but because there was a place for one to be. He looked up into the loft of the heart tree. Snow fell from a high bough with the quiet of something deciding. "We cannot do it alone," he said. "We need more words. More of the old speech, not names." "Oaths," he eyed Sam. "Can your books teach a man to say a vow in a tongue he cannot pronounce?" "Books have taught men worse," Sam said quickly, almost with a scholar's offense on behalf of texts everywhere. Then he sobered. "I can write the shapes. I can tell you the path of the mouth. But the sound isn't in the writing. It's in the way the tree remembers breath. We will need wood to listen." "We are in a wood," Ed said. "Do we need a better wood?" Are we to build a ship out of hearts and sail it down the wall like a fool's dream? We will need more groves, Jon said. There are more old places. The wall's length is a chain of them. We will make a rope of that chain. He did not know if the metaphor made sense, but the image held him. Light strung in the cold, a living thing strung through. We will teach the horn to speak at each, and the breath will cross from one to the next like geese in sky formation. Then when we blow at the wall, the whole forest will answer. And the pale ones will listen and pretend to heed, Sam whispered, remembering the note, and then lifted his chin in an act of courage rarely asked of scholars. And sometimes that is worse, but sometimes it is the only road to better. They went back to the wall as the day faded to the color of a bruise. The snow squeaked under their boots with that small complaint that means the cold has got into everything. Jon felt his breath fog and he counted it, not out of fear of losing count, but to keep his breath company. Ghost ranged and returned and ranged again. When they came within sight of the black stones and the white height, men on the top walk made a sound that could have been relief if they had permitted themselves the luxury of admitting it. The dead were waiting still. They had gathered in greater number as if offended by the mere existence of a line. The pale flicker had multiplied. Now there were 3, faint, like winter stars behind cloud. They moved in a slow triangle that made the air around them concerned. When Jon stepped onto the yard, he felt the horn start to hum inside his cloak, answering to something far out in the forest. He did not take it to the builder's tower. He took it up to the wall. He stood at the place where the ice bulwark had been mended after some old crack, the seam visible like a scar on a shoulder muscle. The horn warmed in his hands. He put his lips to it and blew. This time the horn did not drink his breath as a well drinks a bucket's worth at once. It took it in a long draw, and in that draw Jon felt other breaths, 1,000 men's oaths buoying his own. He had done nothing to summon them. He had stepped into their stream. The sound went out. It went down. It went sideways. It rolled along the face of the wall and into the ground at its foot and into the firelight and into the heads of men. Not in words but in a calming, as if a great hand had been laid upon every scalp. It went into the dead as well. For some it tore the cold not as easily as a mother loosens a ribbon. For others it slipped and sought and did not find purchase. The pale flickers stiffened. They made the air thrash. They gave back a sound that was not a sound but a subtraction. Jon bent the note, just a little, remembering forgiveness, remembering the easing of knots. He felt the horn test him as he did it. He felt it ask the question that any instrument asks of the man who plays it. Who are you? He answered with what he had, which was not enough and therefore honest. The horn accepted it because the trees had. Bodies fell. Not enough. Enough to see. Enough to let men shout without losing their dignity. Enough to make the pale ones take a step back they pretended was a dance. Ed laughed a single bark. Sam hugged the book as if it were a sleeping child and he a father who had done something right by accident. Jon lowered the horn. He could not blow again at once. The edges of his sight were black with pretty little stars. The world swung like a slow pendulum on a long rope. He stood very still and watched it swing. Inside him something settled. Not a plan. Plans break like ice you think is thicker than it is. Something older, like the feeling a man has when he sees a road and knows he has been walking it anyway. He would call to the groves along the wall. He would join their remembrances through the horn. He would learn the bend in the note that made the difference between breaking and unbinding. He would make the dead forget the cold's name for them and remember the one the living had given, the name that is a hand on a shoulder and a place at a table. He would blow the horn again and again until the pale ones learned that pretending to heed is not as good as heeding. He looked north and south across the line that is a wall and is also a story men tell themselves about what is safe. Beyond the dead lay 1,000 small lives worth being their small selves in small houses. Behind him lay men who had given their breath to something larger because someone must. He thought of his father. He thought of the man who had been his father, whether or not the world wanted to count it that way. He thought of the heart tree's face. He thought of ghosts who were not wolves. He put his hand on Ghost's head and felt the living weight of it press back. The night went on. The dead did not retreat. The pale flickers stayed like a bad thought just beyond the corner of an eye. John stood with the horn and with his breath and with his men. He did not feel brave. He felt sufficient for the hour, and the hour accepted that, and for a time that was enough. The morning brought a gray that could not decide whether it meant to be light or merely another color of cold. John had slept a handful of breaths with the horn within reach, and Ghost pressed across his boots like a snowdrift that had chosen sides. He woke to the sound of a wooden spoon striking a pot as if the cook meant to beat warmth out of iron. Sam was already in the yard with a sheaf of notes tucked into his belt, his hood fallen back to let the morning try its gentle teeth on his ears. He had the hollow-eyed look of a man who had found something worth staying awake for and discovered that even good reasons make eyes sting. "I made a list," he told John as he came near, and then produced two more behind it like a conjurer who regrets his trick. "Places. Groves we've used and ones we never bothered to keep because there weren't enough men to keep them and because the seven held better ale. Old stones where there were once trees before fire or axes or forgetfulness. And a few that only live in stories, whispers of a face in bark that bled sap 200 years after men left. The chain you spoke of. We can't make it all at once, but we can lay the first links where they belong." Dolorous Ed stood with his spear but planted in a drift, the expression on his face as if he suspected the spear might plant him back. "The list says Whitetree," he read, tilting his head at Sam's scrawl with the patience of a goat considering a fence. "It's named for the color. I like a name that tells a man what he's to expect. If it were called Blacktree, I would stay away. If it were called Redtree, I would bring bandages. Whitetree tells me what it is and leaves me to discover how it kills me." "Whitetree is north," Sam said, too gently to be corrected by sarcasm. "Old as anything that remembers. If the horn learned its song at our little grove here, it will learn a deeper one there. There's another 2 down closer on the south side. A ring near the Hob huts west of Molestown that never died entirely. If we can teach the horn to carry one to the other, we begin to have range." "Range," Ed repeated thoughtfully. "That's a fine thing to have when what you want is far away and what you don't want is close by. What do we have for when the far comes near and knocks?" "Stone and fire," John said, and tried to make it sound like enough. "And men, which is the part one mean to keep." He took Nella aside by the gate where the iron studs looked like frozen drops of tar. She had returned with more of her children at dawn. 3 this time, all with the same rope-borne strength in their faces and the same caution of people who had learned too early that promises were doors men liked to close. The smallest clung to her leg and stared at Ghost until Ghost, with cavernous patience, made himself smaller by lying down. The child crept closer by inches, held out a hand, and touched white fur with 2 fingers as if testing ice. "You'll go with us," John said. He made it an invitation that would not be refused. "We need your knowledge of the woods more than we need our own courage. Courage is cheaper and men are always spending it." Nella's mouth almost smiled. "Courage is what men call the thing they have left when there's no better coin," she said. "I'll go because I've walked to Whitetree more winters than you've walked to the piss bucket." They set out before noon with the blue flint of the sky striking their faces. John took 12 men and Ghost, Sam with his lists, Ed with his unsharpened humor and sharply pointed spear, Nella with 2 of her older children who walked as if they had been born from the soles of their feet into the world. The horn went under John's cloak and hummed when the wind found the resin's flaw, an insect caught in amber remembering how to buzz. Beyond the wall, the forest grew not only more wild but more deliberate. Nothing was wasted. A fallen tree laid itself down like a ladder for moss. The holes left by roots drank snowmelt and fed small ferns Z-shaped with stubbornness. They passed places where the snow lay unbroken and places where it had been churned to gray by passing feet that did not care for the shape of steps. Ghost went ahead, which meant that he was everywhere at once. They found the first village in the hollow of a hill that had been bitten at by wind so long that the bite had become the face. The huts were low circles of stone with thatch gone thin as an old man's hair. A line of meat hooks hung in a shed like the ribs of a bare whale. The door of one hut stood half open with snow drifted in. Inside, a table held a turned bowl, and next to it a child's toy, 2 sticks tied in a cross with worn string, one arm wrapped in a strip of blue cloth that had probably once been someone's hair ribbon and had become someone's love. There were bodies in another hut. They had not been dead long. The cold had kept them shapes, and the shapes had kept something of who they had been. The way a woman's hand lay on a man's shoulder even in the stiffer language of death. Their faces were covered with cloths that had frozen where tears fell on them and turned stiffness into crystal. Sam drew in his breath and let it out again as if he were learning to breathe all over. Nella stood with her lips moving, and the words that came out might have been a prayer or a curse. One in the old tongue sounds like the other unless you've learned how to listen. They didn't burn, she said. Either they died after the pale ones passed and no one was left to make fire, or they died alone and no one knew their names to put them on the smoke. Ghost's nose worked, the air riffling at his nostrils with the seriousness that wolves lend to every simple thing. He turned his head toward a far hut at the edge of the circle and made a small sound. John went. The door banged once in a slow way like a man with bad timing knocking for a last chance. Inside, the light was gray soup. There was a shape on the floor under a blanket, small, and next to it, upon a bench, another blanket that had not yet frozen. John reached for it with dread. He worked into an orderly gesture. Lift, reveal, accept. The child under the cloth had hair matted with something that might have been maple sugar and might have been blood. He was 3 or 4, the age before boys begin to make knives out of sticks. His mouth was open, because the breath that had left him had not thought to close it behind itself. The horn hummed without John asking. It did not sing. It waited, and the waiting was a kind of respectful attendance. John set his hand on the horn and felt, at once, a sensation like the memory of being held. Sam could not come in. He stood at the threshold, book against his chest like a shield with softer edges. Ed ducked his head under the lintel, looked once, and looked away to the crack in the wall where the day tried to come through and found it too much trouble. John drew the horn out from under his cloak. It felt heavier in small rooms. He touched the resin with his mouth and gave the smallest breath a man can give and still call it giving. The sound did not fill the hut. It did not even fill the air between John and the child. It went into a space smaller than a hand, which is sometimes the only space a man can rescue. The note was a loop tied quickly, a loop and a release. There are knots that are made only to be loosened, and the horn remembered those. The child's lips moved. It was not life. It was the last courtesy of breath completing what it had left undone. The mouth closed. The face softened in a way that made it impossible to think of war without feeling like a thief. John drew back. He did not cry. His body had too many other wants just then. Outside, Ed said, "You saved him the trouble of becoming our trouble. If I were a god, I'd give you a good word for that. I'm no god, so I'll give you my lunch if we have to walk past more of this." His face was the color of iron. They made a pyre from what the village offered. The hooks, the shed, a splintered bench that had once held a weight of men and ale. The snow hissed and the wind took ash like gossip. Nella sang, but she sang low so that the words would not have to climb. Her children stood with their hands tucked into their sleeves and watched as if watching were the same thing as learning, which it often is. When the last of the flame bowed, she turned and said, brisk, as if business had finally been done, "Whitetree." The land lifted into slow knuckles. The trees gathered into a council around the clearing where Whitetree sat. The great white trunk rose like a bone with no flesh left to disguise its function. The face carved upon it had been made when knives were stone, and the drag of blade across bark had left long pale tears that the tree had never thought to close. His mouth gaped. If a man had never seen a tree in his life and been brought to this one, he would know it was a mouth. The air around it worked differently. The cold was precise rather than cruel. Sounds went a shorter distance and returned with less of themselves missing. Ghost, who gave little attention to sanctity, came as close as a wolf can without scaring the particular birds that live in the idea of such places and lay down with his head on his paws, ears pricked. Sam stopped on the ring's edge as if his boots had discovered a rule. "The book said," he whispered, and then shook his head at himself for conjuring books here. "No, my father Septon said once, when he was drunk and brave against our gods, that there are places where the air is already listening. Here it would be impolite not to be careful." Ed's eyes flicked from the face to John and back. "If it bites you, we'll tell it we live on the other side of the wall and never visit." Nella walked to the trunk and laid both hands on it. Her palms were brown and scarred. Her fingers had done honorable labor. Against the white, they looked like the marks that a storyteller might use to remind himself where to pause. She set her forehead against the bark for the space of 2 breaths, then stepped aside. "It remembers more than you've forgotten," she said. "Talk to it like a mother you made trouble for, and it will listen even if it doesn't forgive you yet." John drew out the horn. The bands drank the light and gave back definition. The dragonglass nodules held the day without keeping it. He placed his fingers along the curve because holding it like a bard's instrument made his breath behave a certain way. He raised it. He did not blow at once. He waited until the waiting itself made a shape that the horn could follow. When he breathed, the horn took it with a gratitude that made his mouth hurt. The note laid itself onto the bark like a blanket. John felt it in his teeth. He felt it under his eyelids, like snow light making you squint when you look down. He felt it most of all through his skull into the tree and then down, a long slow pouring into a vessel that had expected him. The old lines of the horn's script heated under his fingers, not with fire, but with friction against memory. The tree answered not with a note because wood does not sing like that except when it burns, but with a change in the tone of the world. Things that had not been connected found a reason to pretend they were. The fungi web under the forest floor twitched with the gossip of sap. He gave the bend to the note that he had learned in the small grove, the forgiving turn. Here it unwound with more patience, as if long fingers were trying the knot and not offended by its cleverness, only determined. He thought of oaths again, the ones men speak and the ones their bones understand without words. He thought of the wall and the idea of keeping. He let that be the message. The horn made it larger. At the far tree-line beyond sight of any man, a figure on pale shivers of armor turned its head very slowly. In the air around it, the cold went out like a spilled bowl and lay there, a wide, shallow wrongness. It could hear what the tree heard, or it could feel that something was listening to a thing that did not love it. It moved a step. Snow did not squeak under its foot. The air hurried to fill its shape and could not. John felt the push again, cleaner and stronger, an annulment offered as a courtesy. He refused it with the stubbornness of a winter gate. He did not brace against it like a challenge. He made room for it and found that when he left it nowhere to land but the oath he had set in the note, it had less to say. He ceased before endurance became pride. When the sound gentled itself into the bark and slept there, he lowered the horn, and his breath came back to him with the taste of resin and red sap laden with secrets. Sam's knees went loose as if someone had sent a laugh up his legs from the earth. Ed looked angry with relief. Nella stood very straight, and in her eyes a thing like respect had taken its boots off so it would not track in dirt. "You make it sound like not death," she said. "Most men only sound like fear when they try to do that. Fear's a good sound. I like it when it keeps a man inside his skin, but it doesn't speak to the dead." "We taught the horn the deep song," Sam breathed, as if announcing to a hall empty but for spirits. "Now when we blow at the wall, the breath will carry this place with it. It will tell the cold that there is an older cold here that belongs to the trees and that it hasn't the manners to supplant it." Ed tapped his spear against a root. "If you are about to tell me that trees have their own version of the Night's Watch, I should like to sign up for it. They stand still, they don't climb, and they sleep half the year." Something cracked in the cold. Not nearby, not far. John lifted his head like a stag who has sensed an arrow reconsider its direction. Ghost was up at once, white and urgent, the suggestion of a snarl braided with the suggestion of a song. Nella's children had already slipped behind a root. She drew her knife, not because she thought it would cut winter, but because a woman who has a knife knows where her hands are. They came not as a charge but as an answer to a question John had asked by breathing. The first whites appeared in the interstices between trunks, not bothering with the drama of surprise. They came in their slow, wrong cadence, bodies that had once been clever at small tasks now committed to one stupid one. Behind them the air shaped itself around a horse that had been ice before it had ever been anything else, and upon it sat the idea of a man carried to such an extreme that it had shaken off the human as unnecessary. Its eyes were the color that men call blue when they are speaking of beautiful things and the opposite of that when they are not. Frost spooled from the joints of its armor as a gutter will blacken with clotted snow. The horn grew heavy as a choice. John set it to his mouth and took breath as if he were filling a cask he had tapped himself. He did not look away from the walker. He blew, and the sound went thin and true into the grove and then away, drawn along Wood's old appetite for listening. He bent it at the forgiving place, and then, because he could feel the walker's refusal before it came, he bent it at a new place, one he had not known before Whitetree had told him where to put his mouth. It was a bend like the sound of a door hinge when it has been oiled. It made the note remember that not all letting go is loss. Some is making room. The first rank of whites shuddered. A man whose beard had been braided in life with little bones toppled like a prize falling off a poor shelf. A woman with one eye and one hand took a step backward, which is not a movement whites frequently admit. Two more fell and did not reassemble themselves into cruelty. The walker's horse stamped, and where its hoof struck, the frost cracked new patterns into the air. The walker lifted its hand. John felt the horn fill with not music. It was like hearing your own name mispronounced on purpose. He almost stopped because the sensation violated something too deep to put words to. He did not stop. He pressed his mouth harder to the resin until his lips hurt and he tasted sap and salt. He poured the wall's vow through the bend, through the tree, through the chain Sam had drawn upon paper and he had drawn upon wood, and he told the dead what they were called in a tongue that had never been written down because it belonged to breath and snow and what snow covers until snow goes. He said, "This is not yours," and he said, "You need not be kept any longer," and he said, "Go where breath goes when it remembers it is not a prisoner of ribs." The walker's head tilted. It did not have a mouth like a man's, but something about the plate where a mouth should be suggested a smile the way ice suggests a reflection, true and warped at once. It made a small motion, a dismissal, perhaps, or a gracious acceptance of a conversation it meant to end later. The whites that had fallen did not rise. The ones behind them took a pace to the side and then another, slow, like a school of fish disturbed by a shadow. The walker turned its horse, a pivot elegant as a thought, and withdrew the way a man withdraws from a room he intends to return to with different shoes. John lowered the horn. The grove's silence came back in such a rush that his ears popped the way a traveler's will when mountains are taken from him too quickly. He felt light and ill. Ghost leaned against his leg with that brute delicacy that bigger hearts learn. "That one counts," Ed said softly. "I don't like being counted. I always come up short." "He's not a he," Sam said. "Or a he the way a knife is a brother. I don't mean to argue. It doesn't matter what I mean. We should go." "Not yet," Nella said. She had put her hand to the bark again. Her eyes were wet without weeping. "They never come once. They try the door twice to teach it what being a door means. You showed them the hinge. They'll bring oil next time." They waited an hour in which the cold deepened enough to lay a fresh rim of rime on men's beards, and the horn grew a faint fur of frost upon the bands that made John brush it away with his glove. No second visit came. That was worse. The return to the wall was like walking back into a habit. Men on the top walk moved with that brittle efficiency that means no one has died in the last hour, but everyone suspects the hour has sent to ask whether it might. John mounted the steps with Ghost ahead and the horn warm again under his cloak. He went to the scar seam in the ice, set the mouth to his lips, and blew Whitetree's answer at the dead. It stretched. He could feel it stretch like a net set wider. The sound flowed farther down the face, farther under the torches, farther into the dark. The first rows of whites collapsed like badly stacked chairs. Some broke apart into pieces that remembered their names and lay. Others shivered and stood uncertain. the movement of sheep who have lost the dog's stare and regret it without understanding why. The cold flickers drew back like waves, and then stopped, as if a line had been marked on water. Men shouted. Some laughed, because men will laugh when fears not loosens even if it lets in tears. Ed said, "I'm beginning to like Whitetree. I didn't expect to like any trees except the ones I burn." Sam grinned through chapped lips that had forgotten how to. "It works," he said, as if announcing the sun. Then the scholar in him, greedy for precision even in happiness, added, "Here. It works here. Then we carry here with us," John said. "Mole's Town next." He looked past the torches to the dark beyond them, and Eastwatch and Greyguard and the Shadow Tower, and every place where a man once stood and called his breath to serve. "We will lay the chain. Lay it quietly," Ed said. "If we bang the links too loudly, our friends in blue will think to ask us why we are making jewelry without inviting them to admire it." They did not all go. Command requires that some men remain to make their fear useful for the men who leave. John asked Othel Yarwick to mind the lifts and the groutings and to mind them as if the wall were his favorite child and mischievous. He set Bowen Marsh over the stores and told him too little to argue with and too much to allow him to fall into the comfort of routine. He left Elmar and PYP and Gren with Ed, because he meant to bring the horn back to a wall that still had its jokes intact. He took a smaller party south to the ring near the hob huts. Twisted little circles of stone where old women sold warmed beer and warmth and sometimes the thing that men are too proud to think they buy. The ring lay in a copse of birches that had somehow escaped men's eagerness for straight timber. Their bark peeled like paper letters written by an impatient hand. The heart of the ring was a mere stump, but the stump bled slow sap at the touch, and that was enough to tell the horn where to listen. John blew and felt the note catch on a roughness in the wood and turn that roughness into a hook to hang sound from. The chain lengthened. He felt Eastwatch wake with a start, as a man wakes when someone speaks his name from another room. Greyguard felt farther and sleepy. The Shadow Tower felt like a man who was not yet listening because he was busy making sure his fire behaved. On the second day, Tormund Giantsbane came through the gate with a dozen of his enormous laugh and the frost clinging to his beard like trophies. He looked the way a story looks when it has climbed out of a mouth and has to learn to walk. He flung out his arms and boomed, "You've got my cursed toy in your hand, boy. I told you not to blow it, and I see from the state of your men's eyes that you've been blowing it plenty." John felt relief come to him like soup at the end of a thin day. Tormund had a talent for making fear sit down and behave, at least for a few minutes in his company. "You sent it," John said. "You made me responsible for your bad ideas." He held up the horn. "It works. Everything works until it stops," Tormund declared cheerfully. He sniffed, looked insulted by the air, and clapped Ed on the back hard enough to make him stumble. "You look as if you've married your fate and are learning the domestic arts, Crow. I like you for it. A man who cooks his own doom eats it warm." Ed rubbed his shoulder with a face that concluded one more indignity would not make a difference in the total. "If doom is warm, I shall have seconds." Sam launched into explanation with the declarative joy of someone who believes his words can do as much as his hands. Tormund listened with his head tilted as if he suspected there was a riddle hiding in the rational. When Sam finished, he shook his great head so the frost flew. "You're playing winter like a harp," he said, almost approving. "Careful you don't snap a string and cut your own throat." "We need paths to the other groves," John said, "on both sides of the wall, places where the wood still remembers its words." "I'll show you the north ones," Tormund said at once. "I've pissed on half of them and drank at the rest. The trees didn't complain because the trees are polite if you're polite to them, and I always am when I remember." He sobered with a swiftness that always proved his noise was armor he could set aside. "But when we go, we move like meat with wolves watching. They know you found a way to talk to something they cannot. They'll try to put their fingers in your mouth and make you bite your own tongue." They set out again, this time east along the line where the wall's shadow made its own weather. The sky had gone the pale color of worn steel. The snow squeaked underfoot so fiercely that it might have been trying to warn them of themselves. Tormund led with the ease of a fool who'd been lucky often enough to mistake luck for skill. Ghost traced in great arcs beside the party, appearing in places that no sane wolf would choose and therefore the perfect places for him. Sam walked with his eyes flicking between the world and the lists he had tucked like talismans. Ed walked as if the air might decide to take him and had better be talked out of it with an example of indifference. The first of the northern groves Tormund showed them sat upon a hump of earth that rumor called a barrow. The trees there were smaller than Whitetree, but their faces had been carved with the patient care of a craftsman who knows his gods will judge the work as a man judges his children, softly for the mistakes as long as love shows through. The ground was strange, as if it had risen recently to look men in the eyes. The horn found it hungry for note. Jon blew, and felt something large and slow turn over under the earth the way a sleeper rolls toward the warmth. He did not attempt to put that into words. He would have sounded like a frightened man trying to be a poet. In the night, they camped in a hollow where the wind spun its anger over their heads and wasted it on nothing. Tormund told a story that was mostly true about a woman he claimed to have stolen from a man made of ice and a bear he claimed to have persuaded to share a cave with them. Nella answered him with a story that had no jokes in it at all about a child taken by a blue woman with a face like a mirror. The blue woman had raised the child in a hall of wind where no one ate and no one slept, and after a year the child asked to go home and the blue woman sent him with a breath that was winter. He walked and turned around, and when he arrived he had the same look as people who have lived for a time underwater. Nella said she had known that boy. He had married and made children who had his eyes, and sometimes in the night they opened their mouths and a little cold came out. No one said anything for a time after that. Fire pops are a language men speak when they can't hear each other. The horn lay between Jon's knees, the band's reflecting flame in a way that seemed to tuck the light away to have it later. He dreamed with his eyes open a while and then asleep. In the dream he walked in the forest, and under every root there was a hand, and under every stone there was a mouth, and every mouth said a name. He could not tell whether they were saying his name or a name he had been borrowing. The names tangled like thread, and when he woke with the thin morning making the world a tired coin, he felt as if the horn had tugged the knot one more loop looser while he slept. They reached Eastwatch's Grove 4 days later, a stand of trees near the shore where the sea's ice pressed against land ice in corals that lasted a season and then began again. The smell there was different. Salt hid under snow, and the wind had stories from far places that did not care about men's problems with the dead. Jon blew the horn and the note ran out over ice floes like a boy skipping along stones, and somewhere, far out, he felt it meet a place that had never known a tree and decide not to be offended. The others tested them that dusk with a squall. It blew in with the suddenness of insult, white out of blue. Men's cloaks roared on their shoulders, and the gusts came in fists that tried to knock the horn from Jon's hands. He crouched to keep it, and in that moment a shape loomed out of the veil, tall, narrow, moving with intention. Ghost leapt before Jon thought. He hit the shape mid-body and there was a sound like glass in a pouch. The shape reeled, and for an instant Jon saw it between gusts. A walker on foot, its armor rhymed with approaching assumption. It reached for Ghost, and its hand left a scour upon white fur like frostbite's laugh. Jon blew, not the long song, but a short, sharp note, the smallest bend of forgiveness, like a word a man says when he has stepped on a child's toy in the night and is sorry for both the pain and the breakage. The walker paused as if insulted by mercy. Then, without haste, it took a step back and then another, and the storm went with it as if leashed. In the lee of a tilted slab of ice, Ed put his forehead on his knees and spoke into his own wool. "I don't like how polite they are when they leave," he said. "Men who mean to come back always say, 'after you.' If one ever tips his hat, I shall throw myself into the sea for relief." The chain grew. At Greyguard the trees were sparse and thin. The horn's note had trouble finding its footing and had to trust to distance. At the Shadow Tower the grove was thick and somber, and the note laid itself so firmly in the trunks that Jon felt as if he had hidden a friend in somebody else's house. When he blew upon the wall after each, the field of silence moved like a low tide and left, for moments at a time, hunks of dead sprawled like broken promises. It wasn't victory. It was not even safety. It was a kind of grammar. They were learning how to say a sentence that the cold could not mispronounce. On the 7th day, as the sun flirted with the horizon and changed its mind, a raven came with a scrap tied to its leg in a girl's hand. The hand was rough from wood and wet and salt meat. The letters were long and frightened, as if they meant to run off the page. It came from a crofter's wife at a hamlet south of Mole's Town, where the hedges had outlived the men who had planted them. She wrote of bodies walking and the wind arguing with itself, and of 3 men who had died so quickly that their supper was still warm when the children found them cold. John took the horn and ghost and half his tired strength. They reached the hamlet when the light was the color of old coins, that hour when the world looks like the inside of a pocket. The farm's dogs were dead in the yard with their mouths open and their devotion gone. The children were in the loft of the barn, eyes like hailstones. The wife had a knife and a comb that was a bone held in her fist. The 3 men lay where they had fallen by the table, the stew's skin pulled like a tight lie over the pot. There were snow patches tracked where none should have been. John could feel the colds not humming in the beams. He blew the note so soft that it was just the shape of breath in winter. He bent it the way the small grove had taught him, then the way Whitetree had taught him, and then the way the sea had demanded, and then, because it felt right and he was afraid, he bent it a new way still. It was a bend like saying a name in a house where the dead had lived a long time and expecting to hear their step in answer and forgiving the house for telling you it could not. The cold in the beams unwound. Something in the far paddock moved, a scrabble and a stop. John stepped outside and saw a shape struggling like a memory in too tight a room. It was a man he knew, Halder, who had once called out from the practice yard that John's feet were wrong and John had corrected them, and the world had changed a little as a result. Halder stood swaying, his head moving as if seeking to remember where to put itself. His eyes did not glow, they watered. Then he folded. John went to him because there is a duty in small things as much as in large, and though Halder's face was not his face anymore, John laid a hand on his hair as a brother does to a brother returning from a long road. He did not cry. He had too many other wants. They burned the bodies. The crofter's wife watched with the impatience of the bereaved. "Will it hold?" she asked when the wind took ash that once had been a man she had asked to build her fence straight and not drink before sundown. "What you did. Will it hold long enough for my boys to be old men and forget your name because they have their own troubles?" "It will hold as long as our breath does," John said, and tried not to hear the cruelty in that. On the 8th morning an east wind brought news before ravens could. It brought a sharpening, a thinness. It made torches burn like insults, bright and meant to make you flinch. Far in the forest 3 pale lights burned holdfast and moved like kings traveling with no entourage and all the arrogance of being kings. The whites massed, not in a line, but in a pattern that felt almost beautiful if beauty is allowed to be the shape of a thing bent to harm. Sam drew lines in the snow with a stick. "There's a rhythm to where they press," he said, half to himself, half to the thrum in his ear that the horn had left there. 3 and 3 and 3, the 9 tongues. They are answering our seal with theirs. He looked up with the confusion of a man who had set the table and found enemies standing where chairs should be. "They mean to sing back. Then we keep our own tune," John said. He felt tired down to where names sit. "And we add a verse." He sent for men to stand at 3 of the groves south of the wall with torches, and for Tormund and Nella to take parties to 2 north rings where the trees had been honest. He told them to blow when they heard the wall sing, no earlier, no later. He told them to listen for the bend and to trust the horn if their mouths didn't know how to shape it. He told Ed something he had never told anyone because some men are not allowed to be told truths about themselves until the world needs them to know. "If I fall," he said, not ceremonious, simply as if saying he would be late for supper, "blow once for me, not the long song, the short mercy. I don't like being asked to be kind," Ed said. "I'm not good at it, but I suppose if I can learn to put on socks in the dark and not die of it, I can learn this too." The first shove came like the world cracking quietly. It was not a sound. It was the absence of one. The air in the yard flattened. The torches bowed, astonished. Men pressed hats to their heads not because of wind but because the absence of it might otherwise take something. The 3 pale lights came on in that elegant stride. Jon blew. The wall answered with all the groves they had taught it, and with some they had not, because sometimes the old gods are generous when men are not wise enough to ask properly. The note went out and back and around. In the snow Sam was drawing, lines braided. Ed stood with his spear and his mouth in a hard line and looked like a man who had learned to laugh in inappropriate places and was now learning the opposite art. Ghost stood at the very edge of everything that hurt and looked happy to be there. Bodies fell. Others stumbled. The 3 pale lights drew nearer until their cold touched Jon's skin like a finger pressing his name into it. He bent the note at the forgiveness and then again at the oil on the hinge and then again at the new place he had learned naming Halder. And then, because he could feel there was one more, he bent it at a place that had no shape until he made it. It was a bend like a father's voice in a doorway when a boy has done wrong and is asked to come inside anyway. It placed shame gently, but it did not apologize for the asking. The note changed around that curve. It gathered the breath of 1,000 men who had sworn to guard what could not be kept simply by killing. It made a place for the dead to leave by. It said, "We will not pull you. We will not keep you. But we will show you the path, and if you take it, we will bear witness." For a heartbeat in which a man could count all the sins of his life and some of another's, the 3 pale lights flickered. One stepped forward. Ghost snarled with the softest of sounds and became motion. The walker's sword drew itself, a crystallization of avenue. Jon played the short note, the mercy, without planning to. It cut the air like silk being torn by a patient hand. Ghost swerved as if pushed by it. The walker's blade touched the sound and made a crack that startled itself. The horn rang in Jon's hands with a pain that made his teeth ache. The ranks of dead went down in swathes like barley and did not rise. Not all. Too many still did. The 3 pale lights retreated the small, contemptuous distance an aristocrat yields when he intends to win by wearing you out. The note did not break. Jon broke before it. He pulled the horn away, coughing up a dryness that tasted like ground bone. The world came back in too quickly and felt vulgar for a moment with its insistence on things like noise and the smell of men. It was enough. It was not enough. He looked along the wall and saw fires answering at 3 places and far in the distance. A 4th, that must be Tormund or Nella because it had a swagger in it the others lacked. A flare that said, "Look at me. I'm beautiful and I dare you not to agree." He laughed once, a short, ugly sound that made the men around him look less afraid because it reminded them their commander was also a boy from Winterfell who hadn't known the right way to hold a wooden sword until someone told him. After, when the night held and nothing came on but quiet, Sam said, "There's a limit." He was not shaking. He had reached the end of his shakes and found a kind of stillness. Not only yours, the horns, can ask a thing and ask again and change the way asking feels, but if the thing refuses, it still refuses. There will be places where we cannot unbind without breaking, and if we break, we will not be the only thing that does. Then we will not break, Jon said. It was unfair to make such a promise, but fairness and necessity have rarely met except to quarrel. We will keep asking better. He slept at last and dreamed of the crypts beneath Winterfell. He walked between the stone kings with their iron swords upon their laps and their wolves at their feet. He carried the horn. The stone eyes followed him like the eyes of men who are dead and still interested. He stopped before one that had no name he could read, because the name had been worn away by the damp, and set the horn to the stone man's mouth. He blew the gentlest breath and heard, from far away, barking, dogs alive and foolish and eager. He woke with tears wet in his beard, and Ghost had one paw on his chest and was looking at him with concern a wolf cannot show without losing dignity. In the morning, news came that the Shadow Tower had seen movement along its length that did not behave like men and did not behave like winter either. Small shrines near their groves had been disturbed. Stones stacked and res-tacked as if someone were trying to remember a game and could not. Jon sent word to hold and to wait for the wall's song. He sent word to Molestown for more wood and more rope and more of the quiet, ordinary labor that keeps a great work from being only a beautiful thought. Tormund departed north with Nella to put a bite in the chain at 2 more groves. He left behind a laugh and the smell of bear grease and a promise to return like a bad penny that is somehow lucky. "If I die," he told Jon with uncharacteristic steadiness, "don't blow for me. I'll find the way without your help. If you blow and I don't come back, I'll be shamed into returning, and you won't like me then." He squeezed Jon's shoulder hard enough to make him a new bruise to carry, and went. Days fell into each other like men when the line gives way. The horn learned the taste of more wood. The wall learned to sing faster when asked. The others learned to step sideways. They came not with charges, but with subtleties. With quiet in the night so deep men woke gasping not because they were cold, but because their bodies had been told there was no reason to breathe. They left little figures made of ice and twigs at the bases of trees, and when you knocked them down the twigs' tips were sharp with a message you could not read but could cut your thumb on. Sam collected these and kept them in a chest with charcoal rubbed over his fingers and the sort of notes you make about a lover who does not love you back. Once they sent a single child to the base of the wall. He was naked to the waist, his skin a blue color that no boy should have, his eyes open and seeing nothing useful. He stood looking up until two men came down on ropes and wrapped him in furs so gently it would have broken your heart if you had one to spare. He did not speak, and when the horn blew he shuddered as if a memory had brushed him the wrong way, and then fell into a sleep so deep that his breathing was all the proof the world gave that he had not turned into something else entirely. Jon sat by him for an hour with his hand on the boy's hair. Ghost lay on the boy's other side with his muzzle on little ribs. When the boy woke he said nothing for a long time and then, in a voice like a window opening into old air, it was loud. He could not explain what, but he looked at the horn and turned his face into Ghost and slept again. They sent him south with men who knew how to travel with broken things without breaking them further. At dusk one evening, when the sky had drawn a thin orange line as if to measure itself, a messenger from Eastwatch came riding a horse that had learned fear and resented the learning. He brought a story of a ship locked in ice a mile offshore with men aboard who had not been dead when the ice came and had not been seen since. They had burned their mast for signal, and the smoke had made a line that went up and then stopped as if the sky had taken it personally. Jon stood on the wall and looked east and west and saw the world's edges like the pages of a book forced flat. He wanted to go and he wanted to stay. Neither wanting was brave. Both were duties. Command is the art of disappointing your desires until they learn to ask for different things. He did not go to the ship. He sent men with the horn's song in their heads and rope on their shoulders and the understanding that they might become part of the Isis story instead of the Watches. He stayed because the three pale lights had learned his name and counted him like a piece to be moved or removed, and he knew better than to give them what they wanted. He blew the horn at the moment he guessed the ice would argue with the men, and later too returned with a tale of a third who had sat down because his breath had decided it was more interested in the cold's grammar and the horn had reminded it of a different language, and the third had gotten up and walked, which is not much of a miracle until you have seen a man who will never get up again. So it went. Groves and breaths and bends, laughter that felt like treason and tears that felt like noon, small rescues that did not add up to victory but made something like a road across which men could keep walking. The horn turned against the dead by turning toward the living until the difference between these felt like a difference in manners rather than a difference in kind. The others learned to listen without learning to hear, and sometimes that was worse, and sometimes it gave Jon the inch he needed to keep a line from collapsing. The night before the 9th grove was to be taught. The last on Sam's first list, a stand so old its roots were said to braid with the bones of a king who had married Winter and asked to be buried in it. Jon went to the small room and set the horn on the table and looked at it as a man looks at his hands and wonders who taught them. Ghost came to him and laid his head upon Jon's lap with the authority of love. Jon put both hands on White Fur and did a thing he had not allowed himself. He complained to the wolf in a language that had no words, and the wolf listened as if a god were being asked for small mercies and saw no reason to refuse. He slept and dreamed of Bran, or of a boy who wore his brother's face and branches in his hair. In the dream Bran sat before a pool that looked like a piece of night on the ground and touched its skin with one finger. Rings spread like the lines Sam had drawn in the snow. "You're doing it?" Bran said cheerfully, as if they were in the gods would at Winterfell and children again. only slower than the trees would like, but they have time. It is men who don't. He turned his head and ravens moved in it as if his skull had become a rookery where letters live. Beware of the 10th, he said, as if making a joke just for himself. There's always a 10th when you count to 9. It hides because it knows men feel clever at 9. John woke with the certainty that he would not be able to explain that to Sam without offending either logic or friendship. He went to the wall and blew the horn, and somewhere far in the line of cold 3 pale lights flickered again, and he swore. Not by gods he was unsure about, but by the taste of Ghost's fur and the shape of Tormund's laugh and the feel of Ed's sarcasm when it lands hard and is meant to hurt you into better sense, that he would keep bending the note until even the dead learned how to bow. The 9th grove lay in a shallow valley where the snow never seemed to pile but always to spread thin, as if the valley had made an arrangement with winter to be dressed without being buried. The tree had a face as fine as a woman's embroidery and roots that showed themselves like old men's veins in their hands. John set the horn, breathed, and felt the chain close. It did not feel like a loop. It felt like a rope thrown across a pit and caught on the other side by someone whose hands you trusted but had not seen. As the sound went out to take its work into the wall, a long crack split the stillness, not like ice breaking, but like a bone under strain that finally remembers it was made to bend. John looked up. On the ridge, the 3 pale lights stood with the calm of lords on a balcony. Behind them moved a 4th, dimmer by a hair, as if it had just been born or had crossed from a place that did not expect it to be needed. It came late like a man who hoped to miss the fight and be praised for his discretion. The horn's note met the 4 and bucked, a horse trying to throw a weight that did not recognize it belonged. John bent the forgiveness and the hinge and the father's voice and the mercy cut. The note strained. They brought the 10th, Sam said, at John's elbow without knowing he had. 9 tongues and a mouth we didn't see. Gods help us. Gods help them too, Ed said, in a tone that made something between piety and rudeness. They've got us to contend with. The 4th light paused, then brightened, then dimmed again. Felt young. John did something he knew was madness while he still did it. He bent the note at the place where the boy in the barn had said loud, and he made the bend gentler. He aimed an apology at the 4th light. He said, without words, you could stop any time you like. We will not keep you. We will not even thank you. We will only let you go. And if the thing that makes you stand turns out to be less strong than that, then I am sorry for you. The 4th flicker went out like a candle fingers have pinched. It did. And disappear in a dramatical way. Simply ceased. Something like a breath moved over the ridge then, and for a moment the 3 remaining were uglier for their subtraction, because purpose without doubt is a coarse beauty. The line of whites behind them shivered as if someone had spoken in a church, and 100 bodies fell. Not enough. Enough. John lowered the horn when he must, and the world came back too abruptly, and he had to take a hand from Ghost and put it on the wall to persuade himself of the existence of stone. Men cheered. Some wept. Sam sat down and wrote without looking at his page because the hand knows its tasks by repetition. Ed leaned his spear against the parapet and actually smiled, which was a sacrilege and therefore a blessing. Night fell with the delicacy of ashes. John stood with the horn and with Ghost and with the knowledge that the 10th hid. He had not won. He had made a language that could be spoken by breath and bark and men, and sometimes that is the only victory the world offers. It is a victory that must be remade each time you draw air. He drew air. He held it a moment, then let it go. He would do it again and again until even the cold learned to be bored by his persistence, or until the wall fell, or until the horn broke, or until his breath ran out. And if another took the horn, he would show them the bend, and if they bent it wrong, he would forgive them, which is the most dangerous song a man can teach, and the only one that turns the dead toward home.